Hey, everybody. Welcome to the GMI Rocket Show. I'm your host, Roman Zelichenko, former immigration attorney turned entrepreneur and the founder and CEO of Laborless, an immigration tech company that automates H-1B visa compliance, as well as the founder of GMI Rocket, which is a marketing agency for the immigration and mobility industry and brings you this show. Today is episode number 88, and I'm really particularly excited. This was a very special one for me. Our guest today is Marc Pavlopoulos, who is the CEO and founder of a company called Syndesus, which helps, among other things, it helps U.S. companies with tech workers who would maybe traditionally come to the U.S. on, let's say, an H-1B visa or some other work visa, and who are having trouble with H-1Bs, whether they don't get selected in the lottery or are, otherwise, they don't want to wait for decades on the green card line, et cetera. Syndesus helps place those people remotely in Canada. They continue to work for their U.S. company, and they basically facilitate, the hiring of fantastic talent in Canada for U.S. companies. They do a lot of other things, and we'll learn all about everything Syndesus does today and all the different products and services they have released since they've launched. I've also been working and known Marc from the industry for a number of years now, so we go way back, and I'm really excited to talk to him and learn more about his story. Probably questions that I haven't asked him before, and learn things that I don't know yet. So I'm really excited for that. So without further ado, Marc, thank you so much for being here. I'm excited to have this conversation, and I suppose finally have you on the show. So thanks for being here.
Thanks for bringing me on, Roman.
Of course. I think for me, again, it's kind of interesting because even when I know somebody, like you and I have worked together for a long time, and we've gone to conferences together, we've spoken quite a bit, but it's not typical of somebody to sit down with a friend or a colleague and just tell them, hey, I want to hear about your life story for the next hour and a half. It doesn't happen. You get little bits and pieces. So I'm excited to learn more. And even as we were sort of prepping for this call, I learned something about you that was really interesting, about your life and about your sort of entrepreneurial journey. So to start with, I like to go kind of to the beginning of a person's life, if you will. But I also like to tie these stories to immigration and a person's family immigration. If they came here, maybe it's their immigration story. In your case, is it your parents or your grandparents immigrated to the U.S.?
Both.
Both.
My dad immigrated to the U.S., and on my mom's side, her dad, my grandfather, had immigrated from Greece.
Okay, and your dad also came from Greece, or?
Actually, he was born in Greece. His
Okay.
parents divorced. He grew up in Germany. And from, I think, the age of 4 on, he grew up in Germany. They basically survived World War II, and then ended up being caught on the wrong side of the Iron Curtain in East Germany.
Wow. That's great. And so when did he move to the U.S.?
Early 50s. I think there was a time where him and my grandmother, his mother, had to escape. I think the wall hadn't completely been built yet, so they were part of that time when you could sneak across.
Wow.
Kind of putting your life on the line, but I think they could see clearly they did not want to be living in Eastern Germany, so they got out. And then you think immigration story, like, oh, and then they came to America. Not so fast. They actually couldn't come to the US, but they could go to Canada. So my father had a PhD. He went to the top German physics schools. That wasn't enough. So the opportunity he got to get to North America was into Canada. First place he went was Vancouver. University of British Columbia brought him in for a year to do postdoc research. So he was there for a year. Then transitioned over to University of Toronto, more postdoc work. Then, after being in Canada for a couple years, only then was he able to come to the U.S.
Oh wow! And did his mother go with him? Your grandmother?
Yes.
Okay.
So they were together there, and then he got an opportunity in New Orleans at one of the universities. They wanted him to do some research, so then he was able to come down from Canada to New Orleans. That was his first U.S. experience. I think he still used to remark about the interesting seafood, and I think that was when he had his first martini. As he said.
Nice. That's fascinating. And then on your mother's side, her parents came to the U.S. from Greece, or her mother. Sorry, your grandmother from your mother's side.
Yeah, actually, my grandmother, my mother's side, was from Mexico. My grandfather
Oh,
was from Greece, so he came
wow.
to Ellis Island and then came over to Southern California, and so yeah, I'm immigrants on both sides of my family from my parents.
That's amazing. I'm curious, did your family kind of talk about this as you were growing up? I mean, did they reflect on or share stories about immigration or anything like that? Or was it kind of like, we're here, we're in America, we're trying to settle our family or get settled as a family, and like let's just look forward rather than looking back.
It's an interesting perspective because what I saw was, I think my mom was like born in the U.S., grew up here. There wasn't an emphasis ever an emphasis on my grandfather's story of coming to Greece. Only later in life would I hear some crazy stories from some of my cousins who would share things that they had heard, but there wasn't that. That was more like, oh, now we're Americans, and
Hmm.
that's I think how she would view that as. Versus my dad when he came here, he's showing up basically in North America in his late 20s, early 30s. So when he was here, I think his take was like he came here with a hard German accent. He was clearly an immigrant, and he was close to his Greek background. So he would go to the Greek church, and that's how whenever he moved around, he would always go first to the Greek church to meet other people in a new city. So I think for him, there was a tie to his Greek heritage, and at the same time, I think he took the path as an immigrant where it was assimilate as much as you can. He did not. I grew up with other friends in the Greek church, other kids whose parents were immigrants to Greece. I noticed some of them were very strong in the traditions. My dad was more focused on, assimilating. For example, on when we were kids, my dad gave us the choice. He's like, because Greek church was like 2 or 3 hours long. I mean, on a Sunday, it was a long amount of time to be there. And randomly, like I think I was 11 years old or 12, and I was just probably like, oh gosh, I have to go again, like sit there and for multi hours. And then so we just one day he asked me and my brother, it's German accent, he's like, on Sunday, do you want to stay home or would you like to go to church? What's your choice? And I was just like, I would like to stay home. And the next weekend started NFL football Sundays. Me and him watching football, and he's like, okay, well, we'll do this now. And so for
Yeah,
him, it wasn't. And my other friends are like, there was no choice. You went to the Greek church
yeah.
multiple times a week. So only later, much as I'm an American football fan now, only later did I realize there's another path that immigrants took, which is don't lose your cultural identity.
Mm.
Be at the church events, always be there. And I realized, that's where I missed out. That's why I say he kind of was more of like one to assimilate than one to say, hey, I'm going to keep up with the traditions I had in Greece or Germany. So it was just a different immigrant journey for him.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because it is tough. I mean, it's tough to come to a new country. You have an accent. You're clearly not from there. And I'm the kind of person that tries to fit in or tries to blend in, I should say, wherever I go, as much as possible, of course. And I don't know. I feel comfort in that sometimes. And maybe for him, he felt something similar rather than, trying to. Uh, I suppose it would be great to stick to his heritage, but then maybe it continues to sort of quote unquote out him as an immigrant rather than an American. Yeah, it's interesting, pluses and minuses, right?
Yeah.
I suppose I bet you that there are friends of yours, maybe who you went to church with, who are like, man, I wish I had football Sundays. I don't feel American. So there's really beauty in any way an immigrant sort of decides to run their life when they come to a new country. But that's why I'm always interested in that question. Um, I want to pause for a second and just to say, for folks who are watching or listening live, please chime in with comments, questions. Share your stories, share your perspectives, or just tell us who you are, where you're watching from, where you work. It's always fun to make this as interactive as possible. We have a comment here actually from Heather, who says, my Cypriot family were the same, really focused on assimilating more quickly and strongly than other immigrant relatives. So it's just, this is not a unique story in the sense that, many people Yeah, they immigrate and they say we are American now, or Canadian, or whatever. Um, okay, so I'm curious as well. Your father, he had his PhD. What did he study? He was an engineer. Is that right?
He
Or
his exact field is physical chemistry.
hmm,
So it's having a PhD in like physics and chemistry. So it's like the combination field. And then how we applied that is once he got to the US, I think he did some research work. He got over to UCLA, did some work there, and then he joined the Defense Department, got a defense clearance, and then had a 38-year career working on, and it ended up being top secret laser research. So
whoa.
lasers were his thing. So that's where I think his degree of combining physics and chemistry, as he tried to explain to me, and it went over my head, but it's that background allowed him to get into his specialty field, a certain type of laser. I think there were dye lasers. I remember like you couldn't usually they didn't have like bring your kid to the Defense Department research lab. It's like it was like not allowed, but there was one
Right.
time he said, well, you can't go to most places, but let's bring you into the lab. And then you just see this laser sitting on this table and these buckets of different colored dyes, all these tubes going in. And then he's like, and then he made some half joking reference. He's like, well, the target wasn't correct and a hole went through the wall. And I'm like, okay, I'm glad that experiment's not happening while I'm here. But it
Right.
was the only time I got to see that. And then other times he'd be like, oh,
Wow.
I'm going to the Pentagon. I'm like, okay. But then then the conversation was silent after that.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I'm sure he did fascinating work. He only far into his retirement would he hint at some of it. But that, again, it was the opportunity for an immigrant to come to the U.S. and to do something
Wow.
they never probably couldn't have dreamed of doing as a physics major.
That's unbelievable, and not just to do it as a physics major in the U.S., but to do it, for the U.S. government, working on top secret, probably the most cutting, bleeding edge technology. And then, was your mom also in? She was not in the government, right?
No,
No.
she stayed home with me and my brother and raised us. And then after we were like high school, then she went back to work. But yeah, she was growing up. She was mostly with us, and my dad was
Yeah.
off
Yeah.
in research
Building
lab.
lasers. Yeah. Wow. That's really cool. So you grew up in Southern
San Diego.
California.
Yeah,
Yeah.
San
So,
Diego.
and you went to, did you all the way middle school, high school, sort of like early pre-college years? We're all
All in
there.
San Diego. Yeah.
So what was that like for you? I mean, maybe both from a study standpoint, what were you interested in, and also, now you're a business owner for a number of years. You run Syndesus, but through that you've built multiple different services and products and sort of companies. Um, yeah, were you kind of entrepreneurial as a younger, person? Sort of, what was it like for you, growing up there and going to school?
Yeah, and I've tried to think of like I'll have one example to share with you about early years entrepreneurialism, but I think early on, all I remember was there was just an expectation of, I shouldn't say an expectation of working, but like, of course you would do something. So from 13 years old, it was paper route. From 15 or 16, it was like fast food. It was like, of course you're going to make money, and that extra money should be saved. But there was always like it was encouraged to work. So I think the earliest entrepreneurial story that got me into a huge amount of trouble. Would not recommend this to anyone, but my parents had put me into I was in Catholic elementary school, then I went to a Catholic private school for high school. Just, again, my parents wanted me to have a better education. They sacrificed so that could happen. Only later do you find out all the sacrifices financially that were going on to make those things happen. It just seemed simple at the time. But that's a classic immigrant story. Like you do what you need to do to have better education for your kids. So at that time, could I tell you that I was interested in business? No, I don't recall it. I mean, it was probably like reading Forbes and Fortune, reading about people that I admired, but I couldn't connect the dots of how to do something about it. But what I do remember doing is San Diego is quite close to Tijuana, Mexico, at a different time in the 80s, or let's say early 80s, when it was easier to go down there and hang out than you might now. It's a little more dangerous, but I think if I go back to my first entrepreneurial story, it was going down there with my brother and then just, bringing fireworks across the border and possibly selling them to friends. And then I might have graduated. Then I'm like, oh, what if you could buy a switchblade for $5 and sell it for $20? And so that's all sounds interesting. 300% markup when you're 17 years old. It's less interesting when you get busted with having one and get kicked out of high school and don't even graduate. So there was a tough lesson there that I had to learn of what you should and shouldn't do in your early years. So I look upon that story as early years entrepreneurialism, but I remembered the buy low, sell high, but I definitely stay on the right side of the law since then.
Yeah, those are great margins, I will say. So you had some good ideas there. I would be too scared to do that in high school. I often, when I ask guests about whether they had, sort of had a lemonade stand or were that type of kid or not, I don't think I ever had any. I don't believe, I'd have to ask my parents, I guess, but I don't believe I had any entrepreneurial like little projects. I didn't sell baseball cards or Pokemon or like Michael Jordan cards or anything like that. I don't remember doing it. I do remember my dad would always sort of joke around whenever, I don't know, anything would be remotely sounding like a business. He'd be like, oh, let's make a business out of it. Like I'd make a good sandwich for lunch and he'd be like, this is a great sandwich. You should go start up make a cart outside. And, I feel like he always sort of made that kind of comment, even though I never did any of it. But I feel like maybe that subconsciously would, make me look at everything from cooking to, realizing I could sell a baseball card for a little bit more or a switchblade or whatever as a business opportunity. So it is interesting that you did that. But you got kicked out of high school, which is hilarious because part of the reason you're doing what you're doing now is because you ended up getting your MBA at the University of Toronto, where your dad, ironically, was on staff. Was a postdoc.
I went to a different school in Canada, but very close to University of Toronto.
Oh, gotcha.
Western Ontario, a couple hours away, but yeah, they have Canada's top business school. So you're right. Like it's at the time I wasn't thinking business, or maybe I was. It was just, and I was living, I was demonstrating what I could do with business. The next entrepreneurial business was doing people's taxes. I was from early college for a few years. I did that. Much more tame and legal and the right thing to do to have a side hustle. Mm-hmm. So I definitely channeled that to better places.
So you did eventually. I mean, I guess you got your GED, so you were able to go to university. After, so you went to. What did you study in college?
So I went to San Diego State. I was a finance major. I at that point I'm like business. It was just like, but the hard part is as a finance major, it's what are you going to exactly do with this? And yeah, that path from university to your first job to when your entrepreneurial journey begins, it's not clear at all. I mean, at that time I could not connect the dots of exactly where I go with finance. I mean, I think the investigation I did was I had an internship at a stock brokerage firm. And I was just like, ooh, this is, it was a difficult one to get. And I remember being like, hey, I'm a year away from graduation. This is perfect. I get hired here. And then you get there and they're like, yeah, we have a whole team of people. You want to work at a stock brokerage firm? You cold call people and you sell them stock that our company has. And I was like, oh, that's not exactly what I'm studying so hard for. Didn't think that was a good path. I was learning it. And from that, that's happened many times in my career. The internship steered me actually away from that type of company. I found that path even during my MBA. Like my internship was, it ended up being in the biotech space, and only being there, you realize, this is how things are here. I think I'm going to go in a different direction. So yeah, it took a while to find my entrepreneurial path.
So, and so after you graduated, you got into the startup space pretty early. before the dot-com crash. I mean, mid 90s, when things were just, I mean, I don't know how it felt for you, but all the accounts that because I was a young kid, and I don't remember, I wasn't watching the business news then, but apparently it's just money all over the place. People start ideas getting funded left and right. It's just the classic sort of bubble. In hindsight, it was just a bubble ready to burst in 2000, 2001. What was your experience though, working in the .com, world, I suppose, for startups that back then, were a fairly new concept as an employer? What was it like for you? Kind of, you don't have to go through all of your positions, but I mean, maybe just a general idea, or maybe some jobs that you particularly remember for, what you learned there.
So I'll give one specific example, Roman. So I was working for a software company in San Diego on the finance team, and then I was watching. I think this is when Netscape and Microsoft, they were just starting to show up on the horizon. This was like 96, and I was like, hey, some stuff's happening in Silicon Valley. There's some software companies in San Diego. I was like working at one that did retail software, but I'm kind of like seeing stuff happening up there, and I'm like, that's the place to be. And I think I just had this realization. It's like, you got to go there. You can't, sitting in San Diego is not going to get it done. So I remember quitting the job I had, moving to San Francisco, crashed on a friend's couch, didn't have a job up there. I was just like, I got to be here. I got to get into this space. I got to figure out a way. And I had never sold anything. And the only way I could think of is I didn't have a tech degree. I wasn't an engineer. I wasn't going to go in through a tech perspective. And I'm like, and I remember the sales reps I sold with, I'd worked with them, but I've never sold anything. And luckily I got the advice from the software company in San Diego. I went to the VP of sales to ask him about how to get into a sales career. Because I saw like all the people on his team. I'm like, wait, salespeople do well. They're driving the fancy cars. They're selling these deals. And luckily he said to me, he's like, Mark, sales is about solving problems. Don't worry about, like, he's like, because he was pointing out some of the people on his team, he's like, okay, some of them are like, really charismatic and really funny. And he's like, that's their shtick. He's like, that's their thing. That's not sales. And he pointed to one of the salespeople who's very quiet. And he's like, look at that guy. He's one of the top producers because he's thoughtful. He solves problems for customers. He's like, you have that ability. You've been doing it for years in the finance team. He's like, that's what it takes to be successful in sales. Listen and solve problems. Life-changing advice. I wasn't going to get a sales job there. So moved to San Francisco, crashed on a buddy's couch, talked my way into a sales job. There was a computer language called Visual Basic. The job was they sold a documentation tool for Visual Basic developers. And you were cold calling people. So you cold called people and you talk to some developer and you get them talking about how much they hated documentation. And it's like, we'll do software for you. You can code, we'll do the documentation. And literally I taught myself Visual Basic. I remember going to the bookstore and buying this book on Visual Basic. I'm like, you better learn this fast. You got a series of interviews coming up. And I was able actually at those interviews to show that I understood what this computer language was and that here's the problems people had with it. And I remember they're like, hired. Lucky break. No software experience, no sales experience.
Wow. That's amazing.
On the sales career went.
So how did it go at that company? I mean, actually, let me ask you this. Did it survive the dot-com crash or what happened to it?
Kind of. So I was there for a year and a half, did well. And then once you're in the mix of Silicon Valley, you start seeing the other companies who are doing really well. You think your company's doing well, and then you start hearing the stories of like, hey, this one or that one. And so there was a company that I admired and they were growing rapidly. So it was called BEA Systems. And I'm like, I want to work there. So the company I was working with hit some tough times and they started doing some layoffs and new people came in. And I'm like, oh, this is how this thing goes in Silicon Valley. As people said, like, oh, it's typical. Companies going up and then they went a different direction. It didn't work and you leave. And I'm like, okay, I'll leave. So I went to this other company, did well there. But then I still had friends at the first company and they went through some changes, brought a new management team, went in a different direction with their software, got some new funding. And they're like, come on back. And I was just like, the people there I still admired. It had to go through some changes. But once they got new funding, I went back there. And then that company, I was there for another 3 years. They did go public at the peak of the NASDAQ. I think it was like April 2000. So they're like Hall of Fame, went out at 22, closed at 92. I mean, all these great things where you're like, hey, that's all great. And then you find out that what no one else told you was you should have sold every single share you had instead of me. I'm like, oh, I believe, and I borrowed money and bought more shares. So it didn't end up well, but it's just one of those lessons in life. So yeah,
Wow.
you could say like, Mark, were you at a place where things could have gone well? Yeah. If I made a different decision, sold my software options, would have been great.
Yeah, that's like people who bought Bitcoin in 2009 or something, and then just like threw it away, didn't care about it, and then now are just
regretting it.
Regretting it. Yeah. Wow, that is quite the emotional roller coaster. That must have been really frustrating to, believe in it. And let me ask you something. As somebody who's an insider, was it just not obvious? Like, was there no writing on the wall within Silicon Valley that okay, this is not sustainable? I mean, these valuations, et cetera. I mean, you were seeing sales numbers, I assume, inside. Just curious.
Yeah, it's a good insight, Roman. Being on the sales team, I could see that I had sales opportunities. I could see the companies I was working with, and all the other salespeople were sharing with me. It'd be one thing if everyone said, our deals are all going south, nothing's getting done. I mean, you saw that. You saw the pressure, like things were getting tougher. So I'm like, okay, it's not perfect. It's a tough sales environment, but sales are still happening. But then I believed in the software. I believe in the dream of the company was, here's a software program that will automate the building of 50 to 80% of the software code. It was an automation. And I'm like, it'll just take time. I'm working on some deals. Other people are working on strategic deals. It'll get into IBM, they'll adopt it, and then it'll 10X. So I believed those things. So the people around me, what I noticed, they acted similarly. They held their shares.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. And so after that, you stayed. I guess you stayed in the industry for a bit, but then you did eventually end up going up to Canada, to Toronto area to get your MBA. What prompted that? I mean, were you trying to just move up the career, or did you see that you wanted to do something that perhaps required an MBA?
Both. What I saw, so the role that I enjoyed the most was strategic alliances or partner manager, where instead of just direct sales, you could work with, like, say you worked with IBM and they adopted using the software you're using, and then all this IBM sales reps are selling it. So then you go from, hey, can I do one or two deals, to, well, they've got a sales army. If I can put my software into that in a company like that, you could do 10 to 20 times the revenue you could do just as a single salesperson. So for me, I'm like, I want to do those opportunities. But what I noticed, the people who were most successful, they weren't just selling, they were approaching these companies. They had their spreadsheets and their models, and they're showing this company like, look, you do this and you get this much lift here, and this deal goes up this much margin. They were playing a different game. And when I saw some of them, I noticed they had MBAs, and they're like, yeah, Mark, the sales skills are part of it, but there's a whole analytics side you want to have, that if you're talking to a company and trying to partner with them, you want to make the case financially. And you want to be able to understand where they're coming from and their cost structures. And I think that sunk in. I'm like, take 2 years off, get an MBA, come back reloaded. But then what I also thought was, or come back and go in a different direction, maybe go into management consulting, maybe go into biotech, maybe go into the life sciences. And I think there were some things that fascinated me about personalized medicine, the idea of applying tech to the life science side. So I think I looked at all that and thought, MBA is the gateway. It's going to open up a new set of opportunities. Worst case, I'm better armed. I can come back to tech.
Why Canada?
I was living in Manhattan at the time. I was choosing university. And one thing you live in New York, I live in New York now. It's a fun place. There's a million things to do. And one thing I felt sure of is I was looking for like a top 20, top 30 school. So in NYU, Columbia, awesome schools, but they're right in the middle of it all. And my take was, go someplace that's top ranked, but where you can check out, not be in the middle of a big city. So at the time, I started looking through the rankings. The Economist came out with their global top 20, the best business schools. So it was Financial Times and The Economist, both came out with their top 20 rankings. And the school, University of Western Ontario, the Ivy School of Business, shows up in both. And I'm like, oh, what's this school? I'd never heard of this school. And I think what the Canada piece was easy because that company I work with, .com, that ended up going public, when I was a partner manager, one of the partners that we drove a lot of revenue with was based in Canada. So for work, I was traveling to Winnipeg, Calgary, Vancouver, Toronto. I'd been there for a couple years, and I've been working with Canadians. I was comfortable with traveling up there all the time. So maybe when I saw the Canadian school, it wasn't like something completely different. I'm like, oh, that's cool, interesting. I didn't heard of it. Let's dive into this.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the spark that made me go there, which is it was a top 20 school. And then I met a bunch of alumni in New York. And then I started understanding the school. And I think the other thing when I was evaluating it, maybe because I knew I had ADD, the thought of, I went back to my undergrad days, and I'm like, the thought of sitting for an hour or two while someone lectures on finance or accounting and just sitting there like this. And I'm like, Mark, that's not your best play. You know it. You know your mind wandered. So there's 3 schools in the top 20, Harvard, the school I went to, Ivy, and the University of Virginia, the Darden School. All 3 of them use case method, which is basically you do your prep the day before, you walk into class, there's no big lecture. There's a little bit of discussion, and then quickly the professor's like, okay, that oil refinery you guys were all studying about last night, what should you do? You know the 3 options: build it in Texas, build it in Saudi Arabia, or don't build it at all. And then the teacher looks around the room, Roman, you're up. Cold calls you. You get up, you go in front of the class, you make your case of, you might have said like, well, my analysis shows it should be built in Texas, and here's why. And they'd be like, great, thanks. Questions? People start hitting you with questions. It was lively like that. Then professor's like, that's great. Thanks for the feedback. Mark, you're up next. And you got to it's like, it was interactive. And I remember doing my research on that, and I'm like, I want to learn that way. So that was another big reason that I chose that school. And it was a very international too. It was a big mix of people. And I was one of like 2 Americans in my class. That also sealed it. It's like I get to work with a bunch of super smart people from all around the world and Canada.
Yeah, from a just an international networking perspective, that's fantastic. And that's quite the advertisement for the school. You're making me want to go back to business school. That sounds really fun. What was the immigration experience like for you? I mean, you obviously are an American citizen, so you had to apply for a student, a study permit. Do you remember that at all? I mean, now you're in the immigration industry. You're obviously very, very aware of what that process is like, even for international students. But I'm curious, at that time, was this something that was either a concern for you or just, something that you really had to keep in mind at all?
I remember being not stressed at all because the university said, okay, look, we've got people coming in from China, South America. Oh, you from the US. Oh, here's someone from Switzerland. They basically said, look, we'll walk you through it and we'll tell you exactly what you need to do. And I remember at some point them saying, okay, you're in New York, go to the Canadian consulate, pick up some paperwork. And I remember not stressing at all. I remember thinking like, this is easy. And because they walked me through it, and then I'm there and I'm a student. And I remember like having that student permit, and I'm like, okay, when I cross the border, this is stapled inside of my passport. Because I was going back and forth, like go see my family in the US, like during breaks and everything. So for me, it was easy. Mm-hmm. You're right. That was my first immigration experience with Canada, was as a student.
And while you were in Canada as a student, did you have any internships there, or I guess you worked in biotech for some time while you were in school? Or was it right afterwards?
While in school. So it's a 2-year program. So in the summer, they highly encourage you to do an internship at the kind of company you'd want to work with. And they had interviews on campus, but my take was, if I wanted to get into biotech, the biotech industry, there's a little bit in Canada, but it's mostly in the US. So my university was like, we can't, like, you're on your own. If you want to, we can help you maybe in Canada, but I'm like, no, I've got to figure this out on my own. So I basically found an interesting way to talk my way into an internship at Biogen, which is near Boston and Cambridge, and ended up with one of the most amazing internships. That was definitely an example of how to hustle. It was probably something, I don't know, maybe it's that ability to make something happen when there's no path. I think that, so I'll give you an example. So for that internship, when I was in software, I actually had visited that company, Biogen. I'd actually sold them software from a previous company right before I went to MBA. So I still knew someone in the engineering group there. So I just reached out and said, hey, I need your help. I heard you guys have in. And so he's like, oh, let me connect you in with the hiring manager. And the hiring manager was also said, yeah, Mark, we have a formal process. This is something, I don't know if you've learned this. He's like, we have a formal process, go ahead and apply. And I'm like, I'm not applying to anything. I don't believe in applying to jobs. I'm not going to be one of 4,000. I knew the interns there. I heard they had 4 internships, and there were hundreds and hundreds of people from like Harvard, Boston University, Stanford. They had the best of the best trying to get in there. And I knew that because I could see the people that they hired. You could see the MBAs of where they were from. I did my research on LinkedIn. I'm like, okay, wow, it takes a lot to get in here. So found a way. One of the alumni from Ivy was in New York, and actually she had worked on one of the drugs for them. So she's like, look, Mark, here's where they market their drug. They use this kind of a program. This is what they do. So I basically took the information she had that was publicly available. And then I'm like, okay, well, how would I sell this drug if I was marketing? So I basically took the information and then reached out to the hiring manager and I just said, oh, I happen to be in Boston. I'm going to be I'm at the Starbucks across the street. Can you meet me for a few minutes? He's kind of like, yeah, sure. You could tell he was very reluctant because he's just like, you applied and go through the process like everyone else. But I didn't. That's not the way. I know that's not the way things work. So basically, he comes across the street for Starbucks, thinking he's going to be with me for 15 minutes. I basically had all this information on how they sell their drug, and I'm like, hey, I want to understand. And I had like a presentation for him. And I'm like, why do you do this? And why do you do this? And he kind of like sat back. He was surprised. That 15-minute coffee went on for an hour and a half. So at the end of it, he's like, okay, wow, you showed a lot of dedication. What I found out later when he hired me, his comment was, no one did that. He's like, you see the people who you're with here. One's from Harvard, one's from University of Michigan, one's from Boston University. You got the 4th place from a school none of us had heard of. You sold me basically back then on how much drive and passion you have. He's like, you had the job actually that day. I wasn't going to tell you. I let you go through all the other interviews as a formality. So it's just I don't know, like you know how this goes, Roman, with hustle. There's if you got to find a way creatively to get yourself out there. And that was one of the first lessons that I learned of, if you really want something, do what it takes.
Yeah, I love that. I love that story. It's really inspiring. And I think it's also a reminder that sometimes you kind of have to do the work before you get the job for that work. I mean, you could have tried to convince him that you could do that kind of analysis for hours and hours and hours, but you just did it. You just went ahead and did it. You did the kind of work that you would have done if they had hired you before they hired you, just to say, look, this is what it's going to look like. And more if you bring me on. And so there was just, I love that. And actually, that's a really good sales approach too. I mean, I found that, if you can help a prospective client truly visualize what it would be like to use your service, right? Not in the abstract. You ask them questions, or you get to, you learn something about their current business or whatever it is that they're solving. For example, for me, with Laborless, we automate LCA compliance, right, for H-1B, for teams that hire H-1B workers. So whenever I get on a sales call, the first thing I do is I ask them, can you explain your process to me, your current process? And then that will help me understand where, if and how Laborless can be helpful. And I'm very transparent about that. I don't try to pretend like I don't know how the process, I tell them straight up. I said, look, tell me how your process works, and I'll tell you if our product can be a solution. There are some companies that I get on the phone with, and they tell us that they've automated this and they've automated that, but they're in different places and such. And I tell them, look, that's actually pretty amazing. You're fairly far ahead. And I tell them, I think Laborless could bring you another 30 to 40%, efficiency. But I'm not going to tell you it's going to be completely groundbreaking. I'd be lying, because I know what you've told me. And sometimes that sale doesn't go through. Sometimes it does, and partly I think because I'm honest with them and I paint a picture that can layer on top of their reality. I don't try to just like BS my way. Other times I was just on a phone with somebody the other day, and they said, they print this paperwork and they have these folders. And then I said, look, Laborless could give you, almost full automation. This would be a massive leap for you. So that kind of, and built a picture of here's what it would look like with the process, with our software, and here's what it looks like versus how it looks like for you today. And that's what you did. You said, look, here's how you're doing your marketing today. All right. Here's how you could do it. Why are you doing it like this? Why are you doing it like that? Here's how I think you can do it to make it better. And I'm the person to do that for you. Like, that's it. You have the answer. Now their job is to hire you so you can implement, right? There's no question. There's no interview anymore. So I really admire that. I love it. I admire it partly because in the back of your mind, you have to know that if it doesn't work out, it will be quote unquote wasted time. Now you can obviously say probably not, because I still learned something. I went through the exercise, but a lot of people just wouldn't do that because they don't want to, they want to know that all the work that they put into it will amount to something. You just took a risk. So I love that. I want to just take a quick pause here. We just had a couple comments. I think Heather was commenting from before when you were talking about what your dad was doing, that perhaps it was some DARPA related stuff, some defense.
That is exactly right. My father got a lot of funding from DARPA over the years. They were his go-to because they were the innovators there. They were like, they wanted to fund the things that were cutting edge. So Heather knows that.
Yeah, DARPA's built some of the basic foundational technologies, or has funded, I should say, some of the foundational technologies. Nan Park says, being in DC, this is definitely an interesting top secret weaponry. Let's stay on that. I think I would love to. Maybe I'll do a second podcast about exposing top secret weaponry. But I think Nan, thanks for your comment. I love that. Okay, Mark. So I want to kind of at this point, you've got your MBA. You're in Canada. You went through that process of studying there, and hustling to get your job during grad school and after grad school. At what point did this idea of cross-border sort of employment come to you, right? Because it sounds like you're on the right path to a corporate job with a great MBA diploma, and you have all this really, really successful experience in software sales, and obviously, despite the .com bubble bursting and the crash, software and technology has ballooned, right? And now there's so many opportunities. So you could have just stayed doing that and been incredibly successful. So what was the thing that sparked this idea of, all right, there's some mismatch between tech talent in the U.S. and sort of immigration in the U.S. and then also leveraging Canada for that as a solution?
That part came a bit later, Roman. What came first was a desire to have my own company. And not just me. I think it was, so a few years after graduation, I was back working at some software sales role. And I would look at the founders and I'm like, I want to be where they are. And once I had the MBA and once I'd been, I was farther into my 30s. I'm like, and then you realize no, there's no magic to it. It's hard work. It's coming up with an idea. I started thinking through, I worked for 7 VC-backed startups over my career. So I got to see different entrepreneurs along the way. Some were amazing, some very technical companies, some weren't. And at some point you start taking those people off the pedestal and you're like, they're people, they're driven, they have an idea. So what I started doing then was I started hanging out with my engineering friends saying, I don't know of a problem to solve. Maybe they do. I'll be the business and salesperson. They come up with something interesting. So hang out with different engineers. There was a small group of us that hung out for a while that were trying to iterate our way through what could be solved. So for me, it was I want to go there. Again, I'm sitting in Silicon Valley, living in San Francisco. My mindset was, what's possible? Let me find a few other people and let's be founders and build a company. So I wasn't looking for any specific problem to solve.
Mm.
It happened. What happened along the way is I'm hanging out with some different people, talking through different, some people are still working and thinking about quitting their jobs. So it's kind of this ideation stage of ideas. And is it big enough? And so I'm having a few of these conversations going on at once. They're not panning out, but I'm seeing, they're getting closer. Like maybe someone quits their job and we do this full time. Right around that time, I think I was talking to some of my CTO friends, and I heard a few of them complain about the frustration of their teams. They had software development teams in India, Pakistan, Vietnam. They were talking about faraway places. And I'm like, what's wrong? It seems like a brilliant idea, like low cost savings, brilliant people. And what I heard a couple of comments from them is, yeah, but there's time zone challenges and you're up all night, they're up all night. It's not ideal. I wish there was, and then it's impossible to hire here in Silicon Valley because people probably reference the H-1B lottery. And they're like, I wish there was an interim solution. And I heard that a couple of times. And then I remember saying, well, then just why not hire a team up in Canada? And the reaction I got every time I floated that, it was like hadn't thought of that. Or I'd hear someone say, yeah, we've got some engineers from Waterloo that they got some really good schools up there. And I'm thinking they have some very good universities up there. And then what I heard someone say, oh, that's too complicated. Canada's like France, you can't fire anyone. And I thought, that's not true, because after my student years, I ended up living in Toronto for 3 years. I worked in venture capital for another tech company. I had work permits. So I worked up there, and I'm like, not true. That person does not understand Canadian labor law. And I thought, okay, Mark, you just figured it out. There's your first company. Syndesus is going to build software engineering teams in Canada for VC-backed tech companies in the US. I put the pieces together then. I'm like, there's your company, and you don't need anyone else to do this. You don't need an engineer to do this. The software, the tech part will come later. I thought, just start the process going. That's where it came from. It's from a desire to be an entrepreneur, looking for a problem to solve, and then realizing I've got these pieces of this solution from my experience. This is my first company.
So what was the first step that you took? I mean, you had to become, in order to help people with this, you had to have acquired some skills or knowledge about how the process works. I mean, you were the recipient of a Canadian work permit, but you had never kind of procured one. So I guess what were some of those first steps you took when you decided, okay, this is going to be the thing that I built?
What I thought my feeling is getting customers is monumentally difficult, and my customers were all going to be, I thought VC-backed companies would be the ones that pay the most. So what I did is I went through LinkedIn, built out a spreadsheet. I found every Canadian founder, VP engineering, CTO. I just went by schools, University of British Columbia, all the way across to Halifax to Dalhousie. Just you go through LinkedIn, you can go by city, and you basically put like someone went to this school and is in tech or a startup. Mm-hmm. Saw the names there, started cold emailing them, asking for a coffee, not to sell them anything. I asked them, I said, I'm looking to build a company, or I'm building a company to build engineering teams in Canada for US companies. I saw that you're Canadian. I saw you went to University of British Columbia. Can I meet you for a coffee or lunch to get your feedback on my business plan or concept? And I did dozens and dozens and dozens of those meetings. And out of them, some people at one meeting I showed up, the person, I'm like, hey, I got some questions. And they're like, can I have 5 engineers? How fast can you get them? I'm like, wait, what? Like, we're here to have a discussion. I have my list of questions for you. And the guy's like, I looked at your website. Sounds like a good idea. Let's go. That's where my first customers came from.
Wow, really? That's interesting. So let me ask you this, and because I've given this advice before, and actually I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. Do you think it's easier to get a phone call or a coffee with someone when you tell them, I have this idea and I'd love your feedback on it, versus let me tell you about my company to see if it can help you?
The former, 100 times. You ask someone, like, I was in Silicon Valley earlier this week, and there's some bigger things I want to do in the immigration space, which, in terms of building a labor marketplace. So what I basically did is I had a few of those kind of meetings where I said, I want to walk through a concept, and I'm asking other entrepreneurs I knew, I'm like, I want you to shoot holes in this. I want you to tell me what's wrong with this. I want you to be as critical as possible. And that opens the door for someone saying, "Oh, you're not selling me anything." It's like, no, I'm not selling you anything. Ideas planted there. And what often happens those meetings afterwards is the follow-up question is, so when are you launching that? And I'm like, I'm working on that. I will get there. And I will follow back up with them. And some of those people who are nice enough to spend time with me will probably say, "Oh, you went and did this. Great. And you listened to how to make it better. Hey, so can you solve a problem for me?" So yeah, it's getting the advice. The customer part can come later.
Yeah. Yeah. I just think that's good advice. I give that advice to, I try to take that advice sometimes, and then I give that advice to people who are sort of starting out on their journey. I'm like, listen, before you sell anything to me, let's just talk about your idea. Don't pitch me anything right now, because I don't know you. I don't know what you have to offer, but I'm happy to help you. I don't want to be in a sales position or like it being sold to at the moment. And sometimes I feel rude for saying that, but I really do believe that is the best way to start a relationship. So I was curious to hear your thoughts on it as well. Quick hot tip. Do you feel, should you buy the person lunch? Because I feel like that'd be the easiest way to get me to listen to someone's idea. If someone's like, I will buy you lunch, so you just come and sit and eat and then listen to me for a little bit.
I did that all the time. It was coffee or lunch. I'm like, I got this.
Yeah.
We'll say the same things. I'll say this week, I was doing this week. I'm like, I dragged you out. I got this. Thank you so much for making the time.
Yeah, that's great. So how did it go? I mean, okay, so you had these meetings, you had a few people say, I love this idea. I had no feedback. Let's go, or let's get started. Let's iterate while we go. Is that how you got your first clients? And I suppose the sort of secondary question is, what was that first service you offered? Was it bringing tech workers into Canada for Canadian companies, or was it from the beginning for US companies that wanted to hire tech workers remotely in Canada?
The latter is US companies hiring remotely in Canada. There was no immigration involved. It was basically, recruiting. I had a recruiter that worked with me. I'd be running around the US, getting companies interested. The recruiter would find the business, and then we'd match them up. Well, we quickly learned a couple things real quick. The US companies are like, this person's in Canada. Our lawyer says we can't legally employ them. So I'd anticipated that, and I'm like, well, conveniently, we also have employer of record or PEO services. People that goes by either, so we can remotely employ your worker in Canada. So yeah, there's a recruiting fee, but then we're going to employ your worker, and they'll be taken care of with Canadian law and a Canadian employment letter and everything. And American clients are like, okay, good, thanks. We didn't know how to do that. That was a complication. So quickly I realized the money's not in the recruiting. The money is in employing being an employer in Canada of workers, and that's where the business devolved. The recruiting part, up and down, some good years, some bad years. But what took off over time was being a remote employer in Canada then the US companies started coming to me saying, I don't need your recruiting. We found the worker, but we need an employment service to legally pay them in Canada and give them stock options and give them 401k and make sure that they're treated properly from a taxation perspective. We're Americans, we don't know Canada. So I went from recruiting business to an employer of record business. And then to an immigration business. All those happened over time. They were never planned out from the beginning.
So yeah, can you explain to me a little bit how that immigration focus came in? I mean, it feels natural thinking back on it now, but what was that? What made you realize that there's some immigration angle to it?
One of my big clients in New York, VC-backed scaling tech company, had a 35-person engineering team in Toronto, of which we'd done some recruiting and we employed them through our employer of record. And they came to me and they said, we have one of our people here in New York as an immigration challenge. Do you know anything, Mark, about Canadian immigration? Could you move them from New York to Canada? And big client asks. I'm like, of course I can. I said, let me research this. So I went to a Canadian immigration lawyer and I said, I need to get a work permit. I said, I remember I had work permits. And I said, I knew it'd take a while. And this immigration lawyer in Canada's like, okay, Mark, when you did that was about 10 years back. Is this worker a tech worker? I'm like, yeah. He's like, they have a tech degree? I'm like, yeah. He's like, okay, good news for you. Brand new program in Canada, Global Talent Stream. I'm like, never heard of it. He's like, it's just started. Goal is to bring 200,000 highly skilled tech workers to Canada. He says, the qualification is easy. I'm like, what do you mean by easy? He says, you said it was a tech worker. You said they have a degree. He's like, salary above 86,000. job offer from a Canadian company. He's like, Syndesus is a Canadian company, right? And I'm like, yeah. He's like, you've been in operation for a few years? I'm like, yeah. He's like, don't worry, you'll qualify. The worker's going to qualify. Let's get you set up. So I moved one person up, and I just was kind of like, that was a favor for a client. It didn't click until 6 months later. Another company came to me, completely random in Silicon Valley, and said, we've got someone who didn't win the lottery a third time. OPT is expiring. I didn't know what OPT was. I was like, explain more. And they said, well, this person will have to leave. They'd have to go back to Mongolia, and they really don't want to do that. And we don't want them to go back. And we, can you help us? And I'm like, I can. It's a tech worker. And so I popped another person across the border. And then it dawns on me, I'm like, there must be many more people with this challenge. And then I learned about the H-1B lottery third time. And then I learned about OPT expiring. And so then I'm like, now I'm in the immigration business. So basically it's taking immigration skills of knowing the Canadian system, having an employer of record in Canada that can employ that person, and putting them together. So I sponsor Canadian work visas for immigrant tech workers in the US who either lost the H-1B lottery a third time and have OPT expiring. Then people started finding me saying, I won the lottery. I've got an H-1B, but I'm never going to get a green card. Can you help? And I'm like, or you just help people with OPT expiring? I'm like, no, that use case works too. I'm basically getting a Canadian work visa, sponsoring it for a tech worker. Canadian government's not concerned. OPT expiration, couldn't get a green card, couldn't get into the US. The L1 didn't work. For them, they're like, that's American stuff.
Yeah.
Are you an immigrant tech worker? Do you want to move to Canada permanently? Do you qualify? Come on in.
Mm-hmm.
So then I've been learning over the last few years, Roman, as we've had conversations of, wait a minute, how else can you use this amazing Canadian work visa to help people who have immigration challenges in the US?
Yeah. And so I guess where you started off, you were recruiting tech workers who were already in Canada to help US companies build out, with Canadian tech talent. And now you've sort of layered on top of that and really focused on, bringing talent from all over the world into Canada for companies, which, of course, opens up the talent pool, if you will, for all the American companies, without having to worry about, I guess, the H-1B lottery and all that kind of stuff. Do you feel like the talent marketplace piece where you're helping recruit for folks is something that is also central to the core of the business, which is helping US tech companies and also helping talent all over the world? Because it sounds like you started with recruiting, but then you kind of migrated almost organically to supporting companies who already have found talent but are going through US immigration challenges. I know that you're trying to, or you're bringing back and really investing more heavily into the marketplace feature. Sort of, again, you're almost going back to what Syndesus was a little bit in the very beginning. So I don't know, what are your thoughts about that, and maybe what are some of your plans on how you want to approach it, if you can share?
Well, that's a good way to put it, Roman, because I started with recruiting, then I went to just the employer of record, employing Canadians.
Right.
Then I found Canada as a good work visa. So I started taking people from the US who are running into immigration challenges. So my client's still a US company, but I'm going to them saying, I'll help you with a person who didn't win the lottery this year. We'll move them to Canada. And then next year, the company comes back and says, it's another year, Mark, another person to move up. So that's 15, 20 people a year moving up, almost all OPT expirations, a few of them H-1Bs who couldn't get a green card. And a few times the other use case is a company says, Mark, we couldn't L1 the person in the US or couldn't get them H-1B. We're going to come to you. Please put them in Canada in time zone of where our US office. So those are 3 use cases I've been doing, but they're one-offs. They don't really involve recruiting, to your point. It's just helping a worker in a company, always a US company. So yeah, I think I looked at that and I'm like, oh, I'm moving 15 to 20 people a year. And then the thought is, how do I move 10,000 a year to Canada? How do I get into real volumes? Which is exactly as you said, it takes me back to recruiting. So now I'm taking the knowledge I have on Canada's the best immigration. US has a lot of challenges, to put it lightly. So arbitrage it. That's the next product I'm going to launch, or next service I'm going to launch, is a labor marketplace where I take immigrant tech workers from around the world, could be sitting in the US with an H-1B and never no hope of a green card, which is many people in our database, Could be someone who had to leave the US, got laid off, went back to home country because they couldn't find another sponsor in 60 days. And they're like, I want to get back to North America. So I'm putting together a pool of immigrant tech talent that wants to leave the US or can't even get to the US. And then I'm going to try this again. And that's going to be matching them up with Canadian companies, or the new twist I'm going to try is American companies who use the H-1B lottery. So basically going to American companies saying, I've got a unique recruiting solution for you. The best of the best from anywhere in the world, but don't use that H-1B lottery. It's expensive. It's a 30 to 50% chance. Instead, come to us. We'll get you anyone you want in 60 days, 99% surety. Canadian work visas are not subject to a lottery. But hey, we're all remote anyway, so that person will just sit in Vancouver, just 2 hours north of your San Francisco office, or they'll be in Toronto, just very close to your Atlanta or your DC or your New York office. So the marketplace I'm trying to do, you're right. It takes me back to the recruiting days, but it's like combining recruiting, good Canadian immigration, and having a PEO that I can employ these people in Canada. It's like stitching them all together. I guess you call it a vertical marketplace where you bring it all together. So yeah, that's what I'm going for. That's obviously going to be tech enabled. I look for AI to power the match between the best of the engineers and the unique needs of the American companies and Canadian companies that hire them. So yeah, that's where I'm going next year. It's just building blocks, or like you said, going back to my roots of recruiting could use some help. What's a great solution using all these different things and challenges that U.S. companies face with the H-1B lottery?
Yeah, I mean it's cool to watch. Part of why I love doing these episodes is because it's really interesting to watch how a new idea isn't always entirely new. It's actually a compound of so many different things that the person has experienced or gone through or learned over the years prior. So I think that's been really, really interesting to watch. And obviously on your end, it sounds like that's where the company is going. What are your, I guess, as we kind of start to wrap it up a little bit, I'm curious, especially, this show, this podcast is aimed at an audience that's in the immigration space. Have you noticed any trends from your perspective for companies that use your services vis-a-vis U.S. immigration? So one you brought up that actually is very interesting to me is like we couldn't bring someone in on an L1, for example. So can we bring them over, to Canada? How does that work? If the person is trying to come in on an L1, that would be intra company. It's within the same company. Your solution is I'm hiring them as an EOR, so they're going to be hired out to me now as a separate company. I'm curious, like, how does that one work?
So in that scenario, it's what we see is it's a U.S. company. They may have a company in India, and they would say normally we transfer them. The reason either the L1 was they were looking at the expense of it. The other side of it, I noticed when we asked what's the use case, what we're starting to hear is I want to bring certain people, I want them in time zone. I couldn't bring them into the US. So what the first comment always is we couldn't bring them into the US. It was too complicated. So maybe the L1 wasn't the solution. Maybe the person couldn't qualify. Maybe they weren't a managerial person versus a software engineer. But what I hear is, yeah, that road didn't work, but time zone matters. Because I'm like, you have a development center. I always think this on these calls, and I'll bring it up. I'll say, I don't understand. You have a development center in India and you have a team in the US. Like, why wouldn't you keep that separated? And the two use cases that come up are, in one case, it's like, no, we need someone in time zone. Time zone does matter. Not all of them. No one ever says, I'm going to close down my operation in India and bring everyone to Canada. It's certain people on the team need to be in time zone, can't get them in. So Mark, it sounds like you can put them anywhere in Canada. I said, yes. And I said, but in my employer record model, this is your person. They're legally mine, but they're working for your company. They have your stock options. They're like, yeah, we like that idea of you as a proxy employer. You're handling the Canadian employment, but the work comes from you. You manage them. You're directing them. The other use case where we're hearing is someone saying, we're bringing this person to Canada to give them the prize of Canadian permanent residence and citizenship. I'm like, who would you give that prize to? And they said, our most valuable employees. It's a way of retaining them. So you tell someone from who's in our offshore team, it could be in India, in Pakistan, saying, can't get you the US green card. Not going to happen. U.S. immigration is too restrictive. But our partner in Syndesus, they can get you into Canada. You'll work remotely from us from Toronto, Vancouver, Calgary, anywhere. And in 12 to 24 months, you will have Canadian PR. And the last, like, is that how it works? I'm like, yep, 12 to 24 months, you'll have Canadian PR. They said, that's a prize to give to your best employees to retain them. Mm. I'm like, that makes total sense. So we're seeing more of that use case. So that, and I think the other one, the L1 is that's where someone, I think I heard also is if they come in, like there wasn't a path for them to stay, green card, decades long wait. I'm like, I got it. So it's just another way to leverage Canadian immigration that also can benefit obviously the worker and the U.S. company.
Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting. It is interesting. I go to some of these conferences and they talk about immigration as a benefit, or I should say relocation as a benefit. Maybe it's a managerial person and you tell them, look, we want to bring you over to North America where you can, if this is the kind of life you want to live, we can provide this for you. Not everybody wants to go, right? People have their whole families, let's say, wherever they are, India, Ukraine, China, Pakistan, whatever. But some people do want to move. And so that could be an opportunity, which is really fascinating. To think about it. And other people could be younger employees too. You hear that about, junior employees who want to work at a company that will just give them the chance to work somewhere else. Maybe while they don't have a family, while they're younger, they're single, they just, maybe they spent their whole life in Cape Town and they want to see what Vancouver would be like, and like working for a company that'll give them that opportunity could be cool. And that could be an employee for life. I remember when I was working at my last full-time job, the company had offices all over the world. And I always, for some reason, wanted to travel for work. I don't know why. I had this weird dream just to travel for work. I guess I thought it would be like in the movies or something. I don't know. And when I finally got this job at a tech company that had offices all over, I thought, this is my chance. I'm going to go to maybe I'll visit the India office. Maybe I'll visit the UK office. And, had no chance. It just never happened. It never worked for me. And I was really bummed about that. I feel like I would have maybe stayed for longer if they kind of helped me explore, some of these soft interests, if you will. Like, I'm still working, but let me work out of London's for a week. I just want to, I want to just see the Big Ben. I don't know. Like, I just want to live a different experience. So I think immigration as a benefit is really powerful. It's interesting to hear that you're kind of overlapping with that a little bit. So I guess as a close, I'm always, I always like to end with something that's maybe different or interesting. I've been trying to ask this question of guests recently as I've, got into maybe you can call this season 2 or season 3 of the show. I don't know, after taking a break. What do you think, now you've worked in so many startups. You've seen companies do well. You've seen companies not do well. You've now run your own business for, pretty close to a decade. Or I should say businesses. What's something that you think you've learned over the years, that maybe you realized somewhat recently that you want to utilize moving forward? And it could be a soft thing, it could be how to work with people. It could be technical. It could be, business model. I feel like, I want to learn from your learnings, and hopefully our listeners can learn too.
One thing that I'm doing this week, which people thought was maybe a bit odd. So I was in San Francisco and there was an entrepreneur you introduced me to. I could have done the Zoom call. We all of us, we do Zoom calls, Teams calls. You can hang out with someone and talk with them remotely. But I believe in the power of meeting someone in person and sitting down and having lunch or a coffee or a tea and talking to them. And I had a great lunch with this person. I enjoyed hearing what they're up to. The conversation is never the same like it is on video. So I had dinners. I caught up with other entrepreneurs that I know. I want to hear what they're up to, get their feedback on what I'm doing. That is all, for me, that is in person. I think there is something about that. And yeah, there's a cost with it, but it's also a way to build a deeper relationship with people. So I think there's people I've worked with years back that, to give an example, I'm in Boston for I flew in last night. I went to an event at the Canadian consulate, or the Canadian consulate sponsored an event. And there's a bunch of entrepreneurs there. There's a mix of people. And I see one person at a table, and I looked and I was like, that name's familiar. And then I thought, and I remembered through LinkedIn, I'm like, I met that guy in 2015 when I was starting Syndesus. He met me for a coffee, and he was the founder of a company. It was a fintech company. I went up, introduced myself. He's like, I remember you. And then we started talking, and he's like, you still at the same company? Because he sees he's like, you're still the same company. I'm like, yeah. He's like, how have you built it? And I look at, I'm like, wait, you're at the same company too? He's like, we built two, over 100 people. And so we agreed to meet for lunch next. Like, I might come up to really have like an in-depth conversation on company. But it was just a reminder of like sales, business, entrepreneurship. There's a lot of hard work you have to do, but the relationships with people that may help you, that you want to get to know, that you could learn from, that can be your customers, go meet them, spend the time, spend the money, have the conversations. Because then, to my surprise, or maybe not surprise, when a couple of years later, someone reaches out to me saying, Mark, I could use your service. And I'm like, oh, what a surprise. Maybe I shouldn't be surprised.
I love that. And
Yeah.
I need that advice too. I think I totally agree with you. Sometimes we get comfortable thinking, especially let's say you and I are in New York, that so many people are in New York City.
Wow.
But you know what? If we have friends or partners or clients in Austin, Texas, or Seattle or wherever, get on a plane, make it worthwhile. Maybe see some other people, but go
Yes.
visit the people that you ought to visit and spend some face-to-face time. So I love that. I love that advice. Well, Mark, thank you. This has been super interesting, and I'm really excited to, hear about the continued growth of Syndesus, and I'm happy and really honored that you came on the show and shared the story. I will link to the company's website and your LinkedIn profile in the show notes for folks who want to check it out. Do check out Syndesus online at syndesus.com. That's SYNDESUS.com. And then, to learn more about the company. So Mark, thank you so much. And per your own advice, when you're back in New York, we got to meet up for lunch and actually talk in person.
Roman, thanks for having me on. I've been a fan of your podcast. As you know, I've been listening to dozens of the episodes. I've always learned a lot. So it's an honor for me to be here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate it. Thanks, everybody. What an awesome conversation, awesome discussion. I learned a lot about Mark, and obviously about the business that he's grown, and of course where the company's going. I really hope that folks who are watching this or listening, especially if you're a tech company or you hire tech workers in the U.S., reach out to Mark. He's super active on social media, very responsive. So reach out to him if you have any questions, or check out his company. If you're also, again, I'm in the immigration space. If you're an immigration lawyer and your clients hire H-1B workers, and maybe they deal with challenges with their tech talent and could use Canada as potential option of nearshoring them, quote unquote, consider checking out Syndesus, and if it makes sense, sending your companies to them. I found, again, in the immigration space, this has been a really interesting topic, which is why I wanted to have Mark talk about his journey and Syndesus on the show. So thanks, everybody, for being here again. Appreciate you all. Thank you for all the comments. Nan says, fantastic segment. Thank you, Nan. I appreciate you. And it's really awesome to meet you recently in Boston. I'm like forgetting for all the travel now. So thanks, everybody. See you next week for another episode of the show. And in the meantime, have a wonderful weekend and stay safe. Peace out.